This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment.
Recently, I've seen a lot of people talk about the idea of the Renaissance man. I first came across this trend in a video by friend of the channel Parknotes, but it also just generally seems like many more people are interested in this quite old idea of what it means to be a thinker. So today, I wanted to look at the work of one of my own favourite thinkers and an archetypal example of a Renaissance man, the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne. In his great work, The Essays, he demonstrates insight and knowledge on dozens of different topics, importantly, including the topics of learning and study. And so if we do want to revive the concept of Renaissance man today, I can't think of a better person to learn from. Obviously, I won't be able to cover all of Montaigne's thoughts here, as they are huge and varied. We'll just be looking at 6 or 7 of his essays out of the 107 that he wrote. And I really would encourage you to pick up a copy of Montaigne's essays for yourself to get the most out of them. But let's begin with how Montaigne approached the very act of learning, because it really is the perfect reply to our modern-day hustle-infused attitude. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The Renaissance Attitude. Montaigne had a really quite interesting upbringing. His first language, for instance, was Latin, since that was the only language his father allowed spoken in the house during his early years, in the hopes of making Montaigne a natural Latinist, instead of the brutal educational programs that were usually subjected to young men of noble birth. His father wanted to instill in him a general love of learning itself, and this does translate into Montaigne's own philosophical approach to education. In his essay, Of the Education of Children, he emphasizes one key point over and over again, that a child should never be treated so harshly in their studies that they lose the enjoyment of it, and that lesson could just as equally apply to adults too. This is not to say that Montaigne didn't work hard. He does occasionally say in his essays that he only ever applied himself to what he found easy, but we just know that's not true. His essays were a labour of love, but they were still a labour. There are a clear amount of revisions, including revisions where he adds in contents from books that he has read in depth between drafts, and these show that he did apply himself far more diligently than he is perhaps willing to admit in the contents of the essays themselves. That being said, he didn't believe in working on anything which he just found meaningless or pointless. For instance, he scorned the kind of rote memorization that was very commonplace in education during this period, and chose his objects of study for interest rather than for some nebulous concept of what he ought to know. And this is where we come to the first pillar of Montaigne's educational philosophy, that we should apply ourselves to what we desire to learn rather than what we are just told to learn. Take his own writing. Montaigne has clearly read very widely, and he cites various ancient and contemporary thinkers in his work, but he's also clear that there are 2 thinkers in particular that he comes back to again and again: Seneca and Plutarch. Of course, part of this is because Montaigne views them as particularly wise and worthy thinkers, but he's also candid that he is led by his own enjoyment. In fact, elsewhere in his essays, he proclaims that enjoyment is his primary motivation in reading and writing, and I do sort of believe him, although elsewhere he does admit that wider concerns also feature, and we'll come on to more of that in the next section. Now, this lesson can feel a bit like common sense. Of course, we should want to retain our pleasure in learning. Isn't that why we've embarked on self-study in the first place? But I think this aspect of enjoyment is something that we've slightly lost sight of in recent years. This came up a little in my interview with Jared Henderson, but the act of learning and the act of reading has lately become closely entwined with a sort of broader hustle culture that I at least think may make us miss the wood for the trees when it comes to our self-study. Part of the reason that Montaigne could write so many great essays and was such a fantastic and well-rounded thinker was because he enjoyed his work. So really, Montaigne's essay on the education of children revolves around a central question. How do we best learn to enjoy our learning? Firstly, I want to recognize just how ahead of his time Montaigne was in even asking this question. Although many ancient authors, including Aristotle himself, have proclaimed that contemplation and learning were among life's chief pleasures, if not the chief pleasure, Montaigne's own time had not always heeded these lessons, to say the least. Montaigne describes the traditional schooling of France as a cruel affair, with students regularly beaten, teachers abusing their power, and the intellectual potential of many a promising young scholar absolutely squandered. Sarah Bakewell, in her biography of Montaigne, points out that his ideas about education here would very much go on to influence many later thinkers, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who would in turn go on to profoundly shape the concept of a modern liberal arts education as we currently understand it. But before moving on, I just want to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsors, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you'll know it can be a real hassle. First, you have to find a domain name and then construct the entire thing, and there's always this underlying fear that you're messing it up and creating something that doesn't just look untidy, but actually looks unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They take all of that complexity and compress it into a single platform, using ready-made templates to extract the complication and pain out of website building. Their block-based fluid engine editing system is also so easy to use and makes it incredibly simple to integrate anything you want into your website without having to master an elaborate coding language. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. But Montaigne isn't just being a kind of crude hedonist when he argues for a focus on enjoyment in our education. He is also highly skeptical that unenjoyable education even produced particularly good thinkers, and certainly not independent ones. He compares the unorthodox education he had as a child with a private tutor hired by his father, who was instructed to nurse the young Montaigne's curiosity, to the more traditional schooling he had had in his later childhood, and he saw that there was just no comparison. He not only learnt much more deeply under the father's system, but he became a much more free mind and free thinker. Nietzsche actually points this out. He praises Montaigne for his freedom of thought. By contrast, Montaigne complains about the effect that a dispassionate education has had on those around him. As for doing what I have discovered others doing, covering themselves with other men's armour until they don't show even their fingertips, having nothing of their own worth bringing out, they try to present themselves under false colours. That is, he saw that the people around him often tried to pass off the ideas of others as if they'd come up with them and attempt to hoodwink the people around them into thinking that they were as wise as the people they were quoting. Montaigne compares this with his own idealized approach. I do not speak the mind of others, except to speak my own mind better. There are two ideas that Montaigne seems to want to keep in tension here. The first is the deep respect and reverence that he held for the brilliance of some of his forebears. After all, how much poorer would we all be if we had to start the whole gamut of human inquiry anew with every generation, rather than being able to draw from the learning and wisdom of those who came before us? On the other hand, Montaigne is well aware of how people can just learn to parrot these ideas without fully understanding them and without making them their own. Montaigne wants to put the ideas of these grand thinkers of the past to use for his own better learning, rather than just seeking to become some human encyclopedia. At many times in his essays, he complains that he has a rather sieve-like memory and so can't just imbibe the quotes of others and regurgitate them at will. But over time, this seems to bother him less and less, because he comes to see that if he has truly learnt something, he should be able to reconstruct the reasoning himself and make it as much his idea as it originally was Plato's or Seneca's or Aristotle's. And this sophisticated learning is another advantage he sees of following his own joy. Part of this almost certainly stemmed from Montaigne's personal disposition. In a quite relatable and deeply amusing passage, he talks about how, both as a child and as an adult, he simply couldn't bring himself to exert any effort on topics he wasn't interested in. So, for him at least, curiosity and personal love were the only things he even could use to guide his studies, otherwise he would just sit around all day doing nothing. But personally, I think that Montaigne can be used as an important antidote to this push towards books and learning absolutely having to be productive in the sense of producing monetary gain. There's nothing wrong with this being your goal. After all, it's worth noting that Montaigne had the advantage of being a French nobleman with a comfortable income and land, and we, or at least most of us, do not. But I think that this can eventually turn reading and learning into just another form of drudgery and work, and slowly chip away at the reason that many of us wanted to learn more in the first place, because it's fun and it's fulfilling and it feeds our appreciation of reality. It is enjoyable to learn new things, to sate our curiosity and to feel our grasp of a topic improving. Montaigne is also clear about the drawbacks of his approach. He knows that he'll never become the most learned person in any particular field, and he even opens his essay on education by stating this outright. But the results of his attitude have their strengths as well. Montaigne managed to write very insightfully on a huge range of topics, from warfare to history to education to philosophy to politics to diplomacy to religion, simply by using this compass of joyful curiosity. Sure, Montaigne is a genius, but he partly became so through his thorough and tireless learning. And he could only be so tireless, despite his self-admittedly lax nature, because he placed long-term enjoyment at the heart of his approach. Having said all this, we ought to be careful here. To prioritize enjoyment in learning isn't the same thing as only studying or learning when we feel like it, and just letting our moment-to-moment desires guide us in all things. Another point that Jared made in that interview is that our enjoyment of reading and learning, like many, many tasks, is mediated by our skill at it. So I'll give you an example from my own life. When I first started public speaking, I absolutely hated it, partly because I was absolutely crap at it. After a while, I've become a little bit more skilled, though I'm still no expert, and it has now become much more enjoyable. In fact, it's one of my favorite things to do. I love speaking live, and I love speaking at schools especially, so if you're a teacher, then please do drop me an email. Likewise, just because Montaigne, at least in this essay, thinks that joyful curiosity should be nurtured through our studies, doesn't mean that he thinks we should never push ourselves. Rather, it's pushing ourselves because doing so will make the whole process more enjoyable and fulfilling, rather than pushing ourselves out of a grim, unsustainable, burnout-inducing duty that promises no joy on the other side. And Montaigne's attitude towards learning ties very nicely into what he thinks learning's overall purpose ought to be. 2. The aim of study. You may well have got the impression from the previous section that Montaigne only values pleasure in his learning. In fact, he has a far more unifying purpose for his studies, which we could call self-improvement. However, in contrast to many of the self-improvement practices we find today, which are often based around pursuing the opposite sex or making money or becoming more productive in a work-related sense, Montaigne aims for a far more general idea of self-improvement, something more like the refinement of his character. This approach to self-development has a long and, I would argue, quite venerable history. I know I bring this up all the time, and you're probably sick of me banging on about it, but Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is, in many ways, a treatise advising that we cultivate our own characters to become more virtuous, and to this extent, it is, in this broad sense, a work of self-improvement, though, again, certainly not one in the way that we'd use that term today. Montaigne's view on the purpose of education is probably best elucidated by seeing how he critiques pedants, people that he, let's just say, disagrees with in their approach to education. In his essay, Of Pedantry, he takes aim at those people who busy themselves with learning that is either unedifying or in fact actively harms their character. Of Pedantry opens with quite a familiar question, and one that I'm sure that many of you will have asked at some point. Why is it that some people can be so very learned, so very educated, and yet somehow also be the biggest fools you'll ever meet? As one of these overeducated fools myself, I was eager to know more. Montaigne first dismisses the idea that too much learning itself is genuinely bad for you, because he notices that some of the wisest and greatest people in history have also been very learned. So it can't be that study itself can turn into a bad thing merely by excess. It must be something slightly more nuanced than that. So then the question arises, how do we separate the kind of learning that makes us wiser and potentially better people from the kind that just fills our head and not our character? Montaigne observes, both here and elsewhere, that if it's not used properly, learning can't improve us at all. It can actually sometimes turn us arrogant and we'll become fixed and dogmatic in our opinions. It's worth noting that Montaigne lived through the incredibly destructive wars of religion in Europe, and he knew just what a certain intense certainty in your own viewpoint could get you. It could get you to killing your fellow man. But even on an everyday level, with a little bit of learning, we can begin to fool ourselves into thinking that we truly are as clever or wise as the people we read. Just because we might be able to reproduce some of Plato's thoughts from memory doesn't mean that we are as brilliant as he was, and certainly not to the same extent or in the same way. In itself, Montaigne certainly doesn't discourage us to learn about these thinkers. Far from it, and we looked at that a little bit in the last section. But he wants us to remain with a certain level of modesty in our learning. He doesn't want us to overestimate our progress. We'll be coming back to this point about modesty later, as it really is key to his overall philosophical approach, but it's important here too. For Montaigne, all our learning should eventually manifest in our behavior or our disposition. This doesn't mean that we need to imitate all the thinkers we read, but it does mean that they can't just pass us by unscathed. We've got to properly engage with them and take them into our characters. So take this video, for example. I'm hoping that by the end of it, you'll know a little bit more about one area of Montaigne's thoughts than at the start of it. But it would be more valuable for you to go and read Montaigne for yourself. And then, even more valuable than that, you would find your actual attitude towards life changed by the experience of reading him. Montaigne knows that this is much more difficult than just learning something intellectually, because elsewhere in the essays, he discusses how much of our behavior is dictated by habit, which is not intellectually involved in quite the same way. And he even argues at points that maybe the parts of our behavior controlled by habit is more than what we consciously choose. Now, I have a bit more patience for learning that might seem useless than Montaigne does, but on reflection, I do think that this so-called useless learning can serve a purpose if it's applied correctly. I've spoken before about how I find it kind of humanity affirming that there are millions of words that people have written on video game lore in their respective wikis, where people will expound theories and catalogue facts about games like Dark Souls or Skyrim. But if I reflect on this a little bit more, this can serve a purpose if it is approached in the right way. For a start, it can deepen the enjoyment of the games, and I think that's pretty valuable in its own right if that's something that we're going to spend our time doing. But also, it could potentially train the intellectual virtues of diligence and creativity. Sure, I don't think it's going to change your life to get really into the lore of your favorite video game, but as long as it's approached in the right spirit, I don't think it can be completely purposeless either, and Montaigne helped me realize that. And beyond this, Montaigne ideally thinks that our learning should eventually be turned towards making us more virtuous people. Now, obviously, this begs a pretty important question, which is what counts as a virtuous person? And this is a thousands-year-long philosophical debate that we certainly won't be able to solve in a YouTube video. However, most of us have some idea what kind of person that we would like to be, not in the sense of material or external achievements, but at the level of individual character. That can all sound a little bit abstract, so I'll give you an example of what I mean. As we'll come on to later, one of the qualities that I really want to inculcate in myself as a person is intellectual humility. This is partly from reading Montaigne. And intellectual humility is roughly the skill of recognizing when people know more than me about something, recognizing my own limits of knowledge, and taking opportunities to learn when I'm wrong, rather than convincing myself that I know more than I do. Like a lot of people, I'm not necessarily great at this all of the time, but one of the best books that I found for setting me on the right track or correcting my course is Cheryl Mizak's excellent biography of the philosopher Frank Ramsey. Frank Ramsey was a once-in-a-generation philosophical genius. He very sadly died at the age of 26, which I think one commentator likened to Newton passing away before he published Principia Mathematica. But he didn't die before setting the course for a century of game theory, decision theory, heavily influencing Keynesian economics, as well as logic and the philosophy of language. He was an astonishingly clever man, and yet one of the things that comes through in Mizak's biography is that, by all accounts, Ramsey stayed intellectually humble. He was often more than willing to learn from others, even people who, if pressed, he would probably say were less clever than he was. And though he wasn't afraid to voice his disagreement with others, he also didn't seem to get his ego involved with his positions. While all the people around him were acutely aware that they were talking to a genius, Ramsey himself never appeared to notice. And this aspect of Ramsey's character is one of the most valuable things I've ever read and learnt, because he serves as a kind of intellectual idol to remind myself of whenever I catch myself getting a bit too big for my boots. Here is someone who is infinitely cleverer than I will ever be, and yet he too recognized the value of intellectual humility and actually managed to practice that in his life. And we have so many sources to support that this was the case. In this way, I'm hoping that the mere act of reading this book, provided that I hopefully do it in the right way, will have a real long-term impact on my character. Of course, only time will tell, but increasingly I'm trying to take Montaigne's advice and actively work a bit harder to incorporate the things that I'm learning, both for this channel and also just for my pleasure reading, into my everyday life. And chances are, you too will have certain character traits that you wish to develop. And Montaigne's advice would be to structure what you're learning around those. This doesn't mean losing sight of that moment-to-moment enjoyment that we talked about in the last section. And actually, in some ways, I think it coheres very nicely with it. As well as thinking that our learning should be as enjoyable and compelling as possible, Montaigne thinks that it should help make us the kind of person that we would enjoy being. Although, as far as I can recall, he doesn't tend to use the term eudaimonic to describe this, I think it would still be a very good word to sum up what Montaigne thinks learning should be and what its purpose should be structured around. However, as often with Montaigne, there is extra nuance to be had here. Montaigne clearly doesn't think that learning the thoughts of others is of little importance if it's not incorporated into your character directly, because so many of his essays are replete with extensive quotations from other thinkers, primarily classical poets and historians. But oftentimes, and this is one of the real pleasures of reading the essays, Montaigne weaves the thoughts of others seamlessly into his overall thinking and argumentation and elucidates what impact they have had on him and his own character and behavior and judgment. Thus, Montaigne himself manages to, at least in his writings, provide an exemplar of just how we can use the thoughts of others to enhance our own thinking and hopefully our own character. Not by neglecting the thoughts of other people, nor by simply repeating them or parroting them, but by gently incorporating them into our own intellectual habits and virtues and using them as examples for our own betterment. Again, it's really worth reading Montaigne for yourself to see this in action, because I really can't do it justice here. It is baked into the structure of the text, if that makes sense. The reason that I personally love this idea from Montaigne is that I think it provides a really helpful guiding principle for someone who wants to learn a lot, but isn't necessarily laser-focused on one or two specific questions, as you might be in an academic setting. I also think that it can just keep us on an edifying track, let's say, when it comes to our own learning. And speaking of learning lots of different things at the same time, that ties very nicely into our next point. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion, book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 3. The dilettantish perspective. In our modern world, there is, to riff on The Lion King, more to see than can ever be seen, and more to know than can ever be known. Montaigne, living in the aftermath of the printing press, has sort of an analogous problem in a more nascent form. In the opening to his essay on education, he confesses that his knowledge is far below the standard that is required of, like, a full-blown scholar, but he says that he will give his viewpoint nonetheless. Since we're now effectively all in a more extreme version of Montaigne's position, we can actually learn quite a lot from how he approaches being a sort of jack of all trades, master of none with regard to his own studies. The first thing to note, and we touched upon this a little bit earlier in the video, is that although Montaigne himself plays down the amount that he's read and the depth to which he knew what he read, he was actually a highly knowledgeable man. As Peter Mack points out in his chapter on Montaigne's approach to reading, we have some of his annotated books, and we know that he was an accomplished and skilled reader who did get the most out of what he read. Nonetheless, Montaigne is right in his self-assessment that he knew a lot of things to a moderate degree, rather than specializing in one particular topic and becoming the expert on it. One thing that this dilettantish attitude ingrained in Montaigne was a kind of self-reflective modesty about the amount that he knew. He was familiar enough with the fields that he studied that he gained an acute awareness of just how much more there was out there to study and to know. He knew that there were great poets he had not read, historians he wasn't familiar with, and he knew that his theological knowledge, which was very important to him, was not up to par with a full-blown seminarian. He knew all of this precisely because he didn't fool himself into thinking that a couple of books would suffice to make him the master of a subject. Things were, and still are, almost always more complex than they first appear. This gave him a deeply curious attitude towards those who he did see as knowing more than he did, and he was even curious towards those who you might think knew a lot less than he did. In his travel journals, which are kept by his secretary, Montaigne is often described as asking anyone, from the grandest noble to the lowliest peasant, what they thought about various different topics, from local culture and religion to geography and history. He especially seemed to want to consult more learned men than he in theological matters, and he is constantly knocking on church doors to see what he can glean from the priests and preachers who lived there. Montaigne will later reference some of the stories or ideas he learnt in his travels in his essays. So, just as he read widely, he also made sure to talk to a variety of people and get their various perspectives on the world, partly to incorporate them into his own viewpoint, as we looked at in the last section, but also because learning so many different perspectives helped highlight to him where reasonable people might disagree on a given topic. It made him acutely aware of the limits of both his own knowledge, but also our collective knowledge. And again, this is especially striking given that he was living at a time where religious toleration really was at a low point, because the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation were raging on in conflict that was both theological and scholarly, but also just straightforwardly physical and martial. This broader view, where we recognize that our position is just one of many possible reasonable positions, was a key part of Montaigne's philosophy, and it influenced his new and pretty unique form of skepticism, which then in turn underlay some of his political arguments for religious toleration. And we don't really have time to get into it here. I just wanted to mention it because I think it is a notable part of his thought. However, there is a sort of flip side to this, because all this perspective taking does have its own risk, which is sort of that eventually it will undermine our own viewpoint so much that we'll be terrified to give our own opinions on anything and fall into a kind of lax skepticism. Montaigne talks about this person as well, funnily enough. He jokes that he once knew someone who wouldn't say they had an itch on their arse without consulting scholarly debates as to the nature of an itch, and, of course, the nature of an arse. And this attitude also wouldn't do for Montaigne. After all, he wanted to shape his own perspective and judgment on the world into a usable and virtue-creating tool. He didn't want philosophy to just throw him into constant, dizzying, paralyzing doubt. It is, in some sense, Montaigne's own slightly less sharp version of Descartes' difficulty at the beginning of the second meditation, where he has doubted everything but has nothing from which to build his knowledge anew. Descartes will try to solve his difficulty by appealing to certain knowledge and then building up from there. But Montaigne takes a slightly different approach, which is sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit. He continues to express his own perspective, but ever so slightly self-consciously. For him, the correct response to knowing that there's so much more to learn isn't to just be silent until you know enough, because in his estimation, that day will probably never actually arrive. Rather, it is to present your own perspective, your own viewpoint, as temporary and open to objection and development further down the line. This attitude is found just everywhere in the essays. Many of them read like Montaigne is working out what he thinks in real time. He will raise objections to his own perspective and then reply to those objections and work something out through this process. And while some of the essays do end by him giving his own verdict, that verdict is often undermined by then deliberately reopening the question for the reader. Montaigne thus writes his essays with a pretty clear knowledge that they will probably be shown as wrong eventually, either by him further down the line or by someone else. But this thought just doesn't seem to bother him, because he doesn't consider it shameful to have been incorrect. I mean, it could only be shameful to be incorrect if you thought that you knew everything, and nothing could be more antithetical to Montaigne's approach to philosophy than such an absurd presumption. As he puts it in his essay Of Experience, it is only personal weakness that makes us content with what others or we ourselves have found out in this hunt for knowledge. An abler man will not rest content with it. There is always room for a successor, yes, and for ourselves, and a road in another direction. Thus, paradoxically, his recognition of his own ignorance sort of freed him up to be rather bold in forming his opinions. It just meant that, at the same time, he held those opinions rather loosely and refused to let his ego get attached to them, since he knows that he will almost certainly change his mind on them in future, or someone will come up with a very good response to them. I've spoken before about what I've sort of gently deemed the paradox of learning. Essentially, if you learn a fair amount about a topic, your opinions on that topic are liable to change a fair amount over time, especially in the details. I've gone on record as saying that I think that me 5 years ago was wrong about an awful lot of very important things, and that even me 1 year ago was wrong about an awful lot of things, and that I'll probably think the same thing about me now in a year's time, and especially in 5 years' time. This initially seems to present a difficulty. To paraphrase one comment that I once got when I made this point, how can we give any kind of viewpoint with confidence if, at a kind of second-order level, we are likely to think that viewpoint is mistaken in just a few years' time? Montaigne, with his mixture of boldness and self-conscious humility, provides us with one solution to this tension. And, as I said at the start of this section, this is so relevant to us today, I would argue even more so than it was in Montaigne's time. It has been impossible to be an expert in absolutely everything for quite some time, but now it feels like it's basically impossible to be an expert in anything unless you devote an enormous part of your life to quite a specific area of study. Epistemically, there's always a bigger fish. For instance, I'm writing a video, or now I'm reading the script that I wrote of the video right now, on Michel de Montaigne. Importantly, I am not an expert on Montaigne. I've just read a lot of his work, and I'm giving you some of my favourite takeaways in this area. If I should be proved mistaken in anything here, then there will always be corrections in the pinned comment. That's how I navigate the tension of wanting to write and form viewpoints on the one hand, and recognising that those viewpoints are limited on the other. But this tension is going to be found all over our lives, and I think it really is vital that we come up with strategies for dealing with it, so that we both steer clear of a kind of certain dogmatism at one extreme and an idle form of skepticism at the other. Even the word essay comes from the French word essayer, meaning to try. And again, I apologise for my French accent, that must have been absolutely awful for you. This is a big reason why I think Montaigne is so important for us, specifically in our internet age. Sure, he has incredibly sophisticated and interesting philosophical ideas that are fascinating in their own right, but he also has an approach to his work that balances this tension between the need and desire to think for ourselves and the recognition of our own deep and irreconcilable ignorance. And this is far more needed today than it even was in Montaigne's own time. In this way, Montaigne's approach has aged like a fine wine. And look, you might resolve this tension between healthy doubt on the one hand and the confidence to think for yourself on the other in an entirely different way, and this is actually something that Montaigne himself goes back and forth on. In one essay, called Of Curiosity, he breaks with his general skeptical-ish themes and instead genuinely considers the idea of submitting to church authority on certain matters of religion, even if he can't understand the reasoning behind them himself. Montaigne isn't a philosopher of definite answers, and so it's unsurprising that even his view on learning itself would go back and forth over time. I just wanted to bring this up to emphasize how the problem of learning a variety of different subjects while also recognizing the epistemic authority of others who know more, while also learning to think for yourself, while also not fooling yourself into thinking that you know more than you do, is just really bloody hard. But it is an essential task if we're going to mirror the eclectic educational tastes of the Renaissance man. And lastly, there is one thing that Montaigne's essays have become absolutely legendary for, and it would be totally remiss of me not to mention it. 4. Knowing thyself. If you were to ask most people who work in the history of ideas what Michel de Montaigne's great innovation was, they would probably talk about the self, or maybe the personal essay. Montaigne is sometimes said to have substantially created the modern concept of the personal essay, where someone gives their thoughts on a topic and draws from a mixture of external research, but also their first-hand experience in their own life. A lot of the most famous essays in history have been of this style, and if you subscribe to most modern-day blogs, chances are they're drawing from the same tradition that Montaigne majorly originated. Obviously, no ideas are come ex nihilo, but he was a major turning point in the way that writing on the topic of the self and personal reflection was done. Montaigne begins his essays by saying that ultimately he is his own subject, and that the essays are, in a real sense, about him. Ironically, this pointedly individual outlook is also part of what gives the essays such a broad appeal, since in looking so deeply into himself, Montaigne manages to express things that end up applying to a broad range of people just because we're all human, albeit they might not apply in quite the same way. At one level, Montaigne's personal reflections and high degree of self-knowledge help him in just a down-to-earth practical sense. We touched on this earlier when we talked about how he knows he won't stick at things that he's not curious about, so he chooses to focus his efforts on areas that he is curious about. And I think we're all familiar with how helpful this particular kind of self-knowledge can be. It also makes him deeply aware of his own faults and shortcomings, which keeps his ego in check. If you read his essay Of the Art of Discussion, a fair amount of it is just him listing his own faults as a man and as a thinker, and wondering how aware other people are of their own epistemic shortcomings. But at a deeper level, Montaigne uses his introspection as a starting point for his own contributions to philosophy and as a way to refine his own original thoughts in conversation with whatever he is reading. I'll give you an example of this just to demonstrate what I mean. So, 2 of his early essays, Of Sadness and How the Soul Discharges Its Passions on False Objects When the True is Wanting, which is a real clickbait title there from Montaigne, together, these present one of Montaigne's most starkly prescient ideas, that our passions or emotions are a bit like separate internal forces within us that can burst forth and often seek an object or an outlet. This idea truly is ahead of its time, and it prefigures the psychological ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche and of modern psychoanalysis. And Montaigne comes to this conclusion partly through examining tales from historians and poets, but also through looking back on his own life and his own experience of having a mind. He actually does this in quite an unusual way because, at least according to his own report, he considers himself not that passionate, but he recognizes that other people do have lots of bursts of passion, and that even he has to counterbalance his own internal passionate forces with the force of reason as a kind of force combating a force. But we also do know that he might be downplaying his own passionate nature here because of the things he says in other essays, such as Of Idleness, where he complains of how his mind has a tendency to rage and range when it's not fixed on something. My point is that Montaigne blends his own self-observation with observations from other authors, and this allows him to come up with a seemingly substantially new psychological theory, which I think is incredibly fascinating. Now, there are obviously limits to this approach because our own internal experience just isn't necessarily generalizable. But Montaigne is not necessarily attempting to originate a grand theory of everything. Indeed, that very goal seems pretty anathema to his general attitude of humility regarding his own ideas. He wants to know how to live his specific life joyfully and virtuously. And if he helps his readers out, then so much the better. But Montaigne's personal experience isn't meant to be universal. It is there just in case others find it worthwhile. But his ultimate project, inasmuch as there is one and inasmuch as he gives it, is to understand his own human life from the inside. And this too reflects a balance between two goals of inquiry in self-study. The first might be to find the truth, or, if you prefer, to find the final answer on an issue. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this goal. In fact, Montaigne speaks very highly of the search for truth, and as a devout Catholic, he clearly does have some notion of transcendent truth bubbling away in his worldview. But another goal of personal private inquiry might be to create progressively better models with which we personally can approach the world, each one recognized as provisional and open to amendment further down the line. And this second goal can certainly complement the first, but it's far less focused on that final point, the idealized end of inquiry, as someone like C.S. Peirce might put it. So, what I take away from Montaigne's approach is that he seems to make a series of these personal models for approaching his own life, and then lets them gradually get amended in line with future experience, and consciously shapes them through his own reflection. Each one draws deeply from his own process of living life, for the simple reason that this psychological data is incredibly important if he is going to learn how to live a life that is fulfilling for him. Even the way that he wrote his essays reflects this, as he is continually drafting them and redrafting them over time, giving them almost the feel of a living piece of literature rather than the final form of his conclusions. When he incorporates his own first-person and introspective experience, he is refining his models for his theory as to how to live. Bakewell actually chose that question, how to live, as the title of her biography of Montaigne, and I think it's very fitting. Montaigne's essays do make provisional claims about human nature, and about the outside world, and about the best way to conduct diplomacy, and about the duties we may or may not owe to tradition, and a whole load of other stuff. But the parts that I find most interesting are those that address what philosophers today might call the procedural knowledge of life. That is, conclusions about how Montaigne is going to do things and how he is going to exist in the world. One thing that I've tried to bring out in this video is that Montaigne is a thinker of internal tensions, which I think is just very, very valuable for a reader of his work. He balances free curiosity and a level of rigor. He balances virtue and short-term pleasure. Intellectual humility is balanced with the boldness of originality. And what he learns from personal experience is balanced with what he learns from the great minds around him and the physical people around him. And these are the same tensions that anyone looking to embark upon a period of intense self-directed study on a wide range of subjects will inevitably face. So, if there is a resurgence in the idea of the Renaissance man, and privately I kind of hope that there will be, then I do think that we can learn an awful lot from Montaigne, who most definitely walked the walk and became one of the most iconic thinkers of the French Renaissance, while still maintaining his joy for learning and his joy for life. And if you do want a practical exercise to end the video, one of my favourite ways to engage with one of Montaigne's essays is to read it and then immediately write my own reflections using Montaigne's thoughts as a starting point. That is, I like to use Montaigne as Montaigne used the great thinkers that came before him, and then add my own personal experience on top of it. And I really would recommend trying this out. Not only will it encourage you to think about quite a lot of topics that you might not have initially considered before because of the sheer amount that Montaigne writes on, it will also mean that you'll be doing the same activity that Montaigne did all those years ago, sitting in his tower during his precious retirement years. But if you do want to try and become a Renaissance man, then one topic that I think is very much worth exploring is how to think a little bit better. And if you want to start somewhere, then I've got a video on that very topic right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.